Grace was feeling really scared and worried. Her tummy was hurting a lot, and she knew she needed to go to the hospital quickly. Her husband, James, was very concerned too. He helped Grace get into the car and drove as fast as he could. Grace was holding her tummy and felt like crying because she was so frightened. She kept thinking, what if something is wrong with the baby? What if we're too late? As they drove, Grace's heart was racing. She could see the streetlights flashing by, and it felt like they were moving very slowly. She kept asking James to hurry, but he was driving as fast as safely possible. James kept holding her hand and telling her that everything would be okay. He tried to sound calm and reassuring, but inside he was just as scared as Grace. When they finally arrived at the hospital, Grace felt a little bit of relief. They rushed through the hospital doors, and everything inside seemed very busy. There were lots of doctors and nurses moving around quickly. The bright lights in the hospital made Grace squint her eyes because they were so harsh. A kind nurse came up to them right away. She could see how scared Grace was and tried to make her feel a bit better. The nurse guided them to a special room with a bed and told them that the doctor would come soon to help. Grace was still in a lot of pain and she felt very anxious. James stayed by her side, gently rubbing her back and trying to comfort her. The minutes felt like they were dragging on forever. Grace felt like every second was taking a long time, and her worry made the wait seem even longer. She kept thinking about the baby and hoped everything would be all right. James was doing his best to stay positive and calm, even though he was very worried too. After a long wait, the curtain in the room opened, and a tall man in a white coat walked in. He had a warm smile on his face, which was supposed to make Grace feel better. His name was Dr. Collins. Grace looked at him and saw that he had dark skin. For a moment, she felt a little uncomfortable. She wasn't sure if he could help her because of her own worries and doubts. Dr. Collins noticed that Grace looked uneasy. He spoke gently and asked her what was wrong. James quickly explained, "My wife is having sharp pains in her tummy, and we are really worried about the baby." Dr. Collins nodded and said he understood their concern. He looked very professional and kind, which was meant to reassure them. Dr. Collins told Grace he needed to check her to find out what was happening. Grace was still feeling nervous and unsure. She felt scared and wasn't sure if the doctor could help her. Even though Dr. Collins was trying to be as gentle as possible, Grace's doubts and worries made it hard for her to trust him fully. James noticed Grace's hesitation and tried to support her. He held her hand and told her it would be okay and that they were in good hands. Dr. Collins continued to be calm and assured Grace that he was there to help. He explained what he was going to do and tried to make her feel comfortable. Grace had to make a choice. She knew she needed help, but her own fears were making it difficult for her to accept it. She tried to push away her doubts and focus on the fact that the doctor was there to help her and her baby. With James by her side, she tried to trust Dr. Collins and hope that everything would turn out all right. Dr. Collins started his examination, and Grace tried her best to stay calm. She took deep breaths and focused on James, who was holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. The pain was still there, but she hoped that the doctor would find out what was wrong and make things better. As Dr. Collins worked, Grace felt a mix of fear and hope. She wanted to believe that the doctor could fix whatever was happening and help her baby. Her mind was full of questions and worries, but she knew she needed to be brave. James stayed close to her, offering support and encouragement. In the end, Grace was hoping that Dr. Collins would give her good news and make the pain go away. She knew she had to trust him, even though her own fears were making it difficult. With James by her side and the doctor working to help her, Grace hoped for the best and tried to stay as calm as possible. Grace looked at James, her eyes full of worry. James squeezed her hand, trying to comfort her, but he could see the uncertainty in her gaze. Grace's voice was barely a whisper as she spoke. "I don't know. Are you sure you're the best doctor for this? Maybe there's someone else available." Dr. Collins, maintaining a calm and professional demeanor, understood her hesitation. He had faced similar situations before. "I assure you, Mrs. Adams," he said patiently, "I am fully qualified to handle your case. I've been practicing obstetrics for over 15 years. Your health and your baby's well-being are my top priorities." Grace bit her lip, torn between her fear for her baby and her mistrust of Dr. Collins. The pain in her abdomen grew more intense, reminding her of the urgency of the situation. Her face twisted with a mix of pain and determination. "No, I'm sorry, but I want another doctor," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't feel comfortable with you treating me." The words were heavy in the air, clearly expressing her discomfort. Dr. Collins's expression remained neutral, though a flicker of hurt crossed his face. He had encountered prejudice before, but it never got any easier. "I understand, Mrs. Adams," he said calmly. "I'll arrange for another doctor to see you immediately." Without further comment, he stepped back and quietly exited the curtained area. James's face turned red with embarrassment. He looked at Grace and then at the curtain where Dr. Collins had just left. He struggled to find words. Part of him wanted to speak up and challenge Grace's judgment, but his concern for her condition was stronger. "Grace," he whispered, his voice strained, "are you sure about this? Dr. Collins seemed very capable." Grace cut him off, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and stubbornness. "I know what I'm doing, James. It's our baby we're talking about. I need someone I can trust completely." James sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. He felt torn between supporting his wife and recognizing the unfairness of her actions. But seeing Grace wince in pain again, clutching her belly, his worry for her well-being took over. "Okay, honey," he said softly, taking her hand. "Whatever you think is best." The minutes ticked by slowly as they waited for another doctor. The tension in the small curtained area was thick. Grace's face was pale, beaded with sweat as she endured the pain. James stood by helplessly, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Dr. Emily Carter entered the area, her blonde hair neatly tied back. She smiled warmly at Grace and James, her blue eyes calm and confident. "Hello, Mrs. Adams. I'm Dr. Carter," she said soothingly. "I understand you're experiencing some abdominal pain. Let me take a look." Grace visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping slightly. "Thank you, Dr. Carter. I'm just so worried about the baby." As Dr. Carter began her examination, she noticed Dr. Collins lingering near the nurse's station. His eyes occasionally flicked towards their curtained area. Despite Grace's earlier rejection, he seemed determined to ensure she received the best care possible. "Everything looks fine, Mrs. Adams," Dr. Carter reassured her after a thorough check. "Your baby's heartbeat is strong and steady. What you're experiencing is likely just round ligament pain, which is common in pregnancy." Grace let out a shaky breath, tears of relief welling up in her eyes. "Are you sure? It hurts so much." Dr. Carter nodded, patting Grace's hand. "I'm positive, but we'll run a few more tests just to be absolutely certain." As Dr. Carter turned to leave, she almost bumped into Dr. Collins, who was approaching with a clipboard. He spoke to her quietly, pointing out something on the chart. Dr. Carter nodded, gratitude evident in her expression. "Thank you, Dr. Collins," she said. "I'll make sure to include that in the assessment." Grace watched the exchange with a mix of curiosity and lingering unease. Despite her earlier decision, she couldn't help it that Dr. Collins seemed genuinely concerned about her. Dr. Carter turned to Grace's bedside, adding notes to her chart. "Dr. Collins suggested we run an additional blood test just as a precaution. It's a good idea, and I'm glad he thought of it." James squeezed Grace's hand, a small frown on his forehead. "That was thoughtful of him," he said softly. Grace bit her lip, a flicker of shame crossing her face. Grace was very quiet, looking at the blanket on her legs. Grace and James came home from the hospital, still feeling worried. Grace put her hand on her big belly and sat on the couch. James sat next to her, putting his arm around her shoulders. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Grace leaned against him, tears in her eyes. "I was so scared, James," she whispered. "I thought we might lose the baby." James hugged her tighter and kissed her forehead. "But we didn't. Everything is okay, just like Dr. Carter said." Grace nodded and wiped a tear. "I'm so thankful Dr. Carter was there. She was really nice and made me feel better." James paused before speaking. Dr. Whitman seemed worried too. Grace tensed a little but shook her head. "Let's not talk about that. It was just a tough moment. What matters is Dr. Carter helped us and took good care of us." She held James's hand, feeling relieved. "I'm glad everything turned out okay. That scary moment made me think a lot." James nodded and squeezed her hand. "I know, but try not to think about it too much. We're home now, and both you and the baby are safe." Grace smiled a little and rubbed her belly. "You're right. I should focus on the good things." Dr. Carter made sure everything was perfect before we went home. As they sat quietly, Grace thought about the hospital and felt a bit uncomfortable about Dr. Whitman, but she pushed that thought away. He was just a small part of a scary but mostly good experience. "I'm so glad we went to the hospital," Grace said, feeling sleepy. "Dr. Carter made me feel better." James gently stroked her hair. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." The next morning, Grace was at the kitchen table drinking tea and looking at her phone. She rubbed her belly, feeling thankful for the peace after the scare. A knock on the door brought her back to the present. It was Sarah, her best friend, coming for their weekly visit. "Hi, sweetie," Sarah said, hugging Grace. "How are you after last night?" Grace smiled a little. "I'm better now. It was really scary, but everything is okay." They sat on the couch, and Grace told Sarah about the hospital. Sarah listened carefully, frowning a bit when Grace talked about Dr. Whitman and then Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter was great. She was very caring and checked everything thoroughly, Grace finished. Sarah took a deep breath. "I'm glad you're okay, but don't you think maybe you were too quick to judge Dr. Whitman?" Grace's eyes widened. "Too quick? Sarah, I was so scared. I needed someone I could trust completely." Sarah said gently, "I understand, but from what you told me, Dr. Whitman seemed professional and capable. Maybe he could have helped just as well as Dr. Carter." Grace shook her head firmly. "I did what I thought was best for my baby. It wasn't about anything else. It was just my instinct." Sarah nodded, though she still looked concerned. "I understand. It's your baby and your choice. I just wonder if there was more to think about." Grace's voice grew louder. "There wasn't time to think. I made a quick decision based on what felt right, and everything turned out okay, didn't it?" Sarah squeezed Grace's hand. "Yes, it did. I'm just glad you and the baby are safe." Grace softened and squeezed Sarah's hand back. "Me too. I appreciate your concern. I know I did the right thing." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Dr. Whitman was in the staff room, holding a coffee cup. He thought about the night before and felt hurt by the judgment he received. Dr. Carter came in, looking happy to see him. "Harold, just the person I wanted to see. Doc, how did things go with Mrs. Adams after I left?" Dr. Carter poured herself some coffee and leaned on the counter. "Everything was fine, but Harold, you handled the situation so well." Dr. Whitman shrugged, looking at his coffee. "It's part of the job. We have to take care of the patients no matter what," Dr. Carter insisted. "But most people would have been upset. You were very professional." Dr. Collins finally looked up and met Dr. Carter's gaze. He knew that being angry wouldn't help Mrs. Adams or her baby. "My job is to take care of all patients, no matter how they feel about me," he said. Dr. Carter nodded, clearly admiring him. "That's why you're so important to this hospital. Your ability to put patients first, even when it's hard, is amazing." Dr. Collins gave a small chuckle. "I appreciate that, Emily, but I'm just doing my job. We all face challenges in this work. This is just one of mine." Dr. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder. I want you to know that your coworkers see and appreciate your hard work. Dr. Collins nodded, touched by her words. Thank you, Emily. That means a lot. The next week, Grace Adams was shopping at the local grocery store. She was thinking about the things she needed to buy. She wanted to prove she could shop alone, even though James offered to go with her. When she reached for a jar of pickles, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her tummy. Grace gasped and put her hand on her belly, trying to calm down. The pain got worse quickly, and she felt dizzy. She started to panic because she knew something was wrong. Help, she whispered weakly. She tried to hold on to the shelf, but her legs gave out and she fell to the floor. She noticed she was bleeding. Nearby, Dr. Harold Collins was looking at cereal boxes when he heard a commotion. He put down his basket and ran toward the noise. When he saw Grace on the floor, he quickly knelt beside her. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted to the crowd. As people fumbled for their phones, Dr. Collins gently turned Grace on her side to keep her airway clear. He saw the blood and knew it was serious. "I'm a doctor," he said to the crowd. "Please give us some space." He asked an elderly woman nearby to get clean towels from the paper goods aisle. The ambulance arrived quickly with its sirens on. Paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, guided by the crowd to where Dr. Collins was helping Grace. They lifted her onto the stretcher while Dr. Collins told them what happened. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. The paramedics agreed, knowing a doctor would be helpful. As the ambulance drove fast through the streets, Grace woke up a little and saw Dr. Collins leaning over her. She looked confused and scared. "It's okay, Mrs. Adams," Dr. Collins said kindly. "We're taking you to the hospital." Grace tried to speak, but no words came out. Dr. Collins held her hand and kept checking her vitals. At the hospital, a team was ready for Grace. Dr. Collins quickly told them what was wrong and that she needed surgery right away. The next few moments were busy as Grace was rushed to the operating room. Dr. Collins scrubbed in, ready to help. In the operating room, everyone worked hard to help Grace and her baby. Dr. Collins used his skills to help with the complicated surgery. Time seemed to stop as they worked to save Grace and her baby. Dr. Collins was focused only on saving their lives. He gave instructions and the team followed them quickly. Even though it was very serious, Dr. Collins stayed calm and focused on the job. In the busy operating room, everyone was focused and serious. Dr. Collins was in charge, and he was working very hard to help Grace, who was very sick. Even though Grace wasn't getting worse, her condition was still dangerous. The baby's heartbeat was weak, and everyone in the room was concerned. Dr. Collins made quick and careful decisions to help both Grace and her baby. The room was tense, but filled with hope. Everyone knew they had to act fast to save them. Dr. Collins was constantly checking the machines and looking at Grace. He noticed that the baby's heartbeat was still weak and decided they needed to give more oxygen. He told a nurse to adjust the machine settings right away. The nurse moved quickly and made the changes. Dr. Collins was sweating because he was working so hard to stop the bleeding. He was very careful with each movement, knowing that any mistake could make things worse. The team around him trusted him completely and followed his instructions without hesitation. As time passed, Grace's condition slowly started to improve. A nurse announced that Grace's blood pressure was getting better, which made everyone feel a little bit of relief. Dr. Collins told the team to prepare to move Grace to intensive care, where she would be watched very closely. The team worked efficiently to get her ready for the move. Grace was wheeled out of the operating room, and Dr. Collins followed, keeping a close eye on her. Grace felt very sleepy and confused. Everything around her was a blur of bright lights and muffled voices. She was aware of some movement but couldn't fully understand what was happening. She heard words like blood pressure dropping, but they didn't make much sense to her. Through the fog, she saw Dr. Collins's face. He looked calm and focused, which made her feel a bit better. Even though she'd been upset with him before, she now felt safe with him around. Dr. Collins spoke to Grace in a gentle voice, telling her that they would take good care of her. Grace wanted to thank him, but she couldn't move or speak. She just closed her eyes, comforted by his steady presence. As she drifted in and out of sleep, she saw Dr. Collins each time she opened her eyes. His calm demeanor was a constant source of reassurance in the midst of the urgent activity around her. Grace began to realize how serious her situation was and felt scared, not just for herself, but also for her baby. She tried to ask about her baby, but no words came out. Dr. Collins must have sensed her worry because he spoke to her again. He told her that her baby was fighting hard, just like she was, and that they were doing everything they could to help. Grace felt a tear slide down her cheek, a mix of fear and gratitude overwhelming her. Despite everything, she felt comforted by the care she was receiving and hoped for the best outcome. As she slipped back into sleep, the last thing Grace saw was Dr. Collins's kind face. His eyes showed he really cared. After a long time of working hard, Dr. Collins sighed with relief. Grace's health was getting better, and the baby's heartbeat was strong. The worst was over, but they still had to be careful. "Let's move her to recovery," Dr. Collins said, his voice calm but tired. They carefully moved Grace to a different room, and she started to wake up. The bright lights of the emergency room were gone, and the room was much quieter. Grace's eyes opened slowly. She felt weak, but the pain was not as bad. As she looked around, she saw Dr. Collins smiling down at her. "Welcome back, Mrs. Adams," he said softly. "You scared us, but you're better now." Grace tried to talk, but her throat was dry. Dr. Collins gave her a sip of water, which felt good. Grace whispered, "My baby?" Dr. Collins smiled and said, "Your baby is strong, just like you. We're watching closely, but you both are doing much better." Grace's eyes filled with tears of relief. She wanted to thank Dr. Collins, but she was very tired. As she started to sleep again, Dr. Collins gently patted her hand and told her to rest. Grace felt thankful as she drifted off. When she woke up again, the room was still and quiet. She saw James outside her room talking to a tall man in a white coat. James was shaking the man's hand and saying thank you over and over. Grace tried to remember the man's name, but couldn't. James's eyes were full of tears as he thanked the doctor. The doctor glanced at Grace for a moment, and she felt like she knew him, but then she was too tired to think more about it. As Grace fell back asleep, she could still hear the soft beeping of the monitors. When she woke up, she saw James sitting next to her, holding her hand. "The baby is fine," James said warmly. Grace felt a bit of relief. She noticed James's face looked relieved, but also a little uneasy. She asked, "What happened?" James squeezed her hand and said, "You fell at the store and it was very scary for a while, but you and the baby are okay now." Grace remembered bits and pieces of what happened: pain, panic, and darkness. But there was something else she couldn't quite remember. Grace was really tired and couldn't understand everything that was happening around her. As she felt herself drifting off to sleep, she mumbled, "I'm so tired." Mikkel, who was taking care of her, gently brushed a strand of her hair away and told her to rest. He said she had been through a lot and needed to take it easy. Grace was very happy that her baby was safe, but she also felt like there was something important that she didn't understand. Grace spent a few days in the hospital. The walls were white, and there were lots of beeping sounds from the machines. This was her new temporary home while she got better from the scary experience she had. She spent most of her time resting because her body was still very weak. During these quiet moments, Grace often thought about what had happened to her. She remembered the sudden sharp pain she felt in the grocery store, followed by a lot of panic. After that, everything became a blur. There were faces, voices, and feelings she couldn't quite remember. As she lay in her hospital bed, Grace kept her hand on her belly, feeling grateful that she and her baby were still here. She had come very close to losing everything: her baby, her future, and even her own life. The thought made her cry, and she whispered, "Thank you," to whoever or whatever had helped them. She softly spoke to her baby, saying, "We made it, little one. We're both still here." Every day, James visited Grace. He looked both relieved and worried. He held her hand tightly, as if afraid that he might lose her if he let go. Grace could see the fear in his eyes, which mirrored her own emotions. One afternoon, James admitted, "I was so scared. When they called me, I thought I might lose you both." Grace squeezed his hand and tried to comfort him, saying, "But you didn't. We're okay. We're all okay." As days went by, Grace began to appreciate life more and feel thankful for the miracle growing inside her. She thought about how quickly things could have changed and how close she came to losing everything. This experience made her rethink what was really important. But even though she felt grateful, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There were gaps in her memory and moments she couldn't recall clearly. She knew someone had saved her life and protected her baby, but she couldn't remember who. The day finally came when Grace was going to leave the hospital. As a kind nurse helped her pack her things, Grace decided to ask a question. She said softly, "Excuse me, I was wondering if you could tell me about the doctor who saved me. I can't remember much from that day." The nurse paused and smiled warmly. She said, "Oh, of course. That would be Dr. Whitman. He was actually at the grocery store when you collapsed. It was really lucky because he acted quickly and got you here just in time." Grace's heart skipped a beat when she heard the name Dr. Whitman. She repeated it quietly. "Dr. Whitman?" The nurse confirmed. "Yes, Dr. Harold Whitman. He's been taking care of you since you arrived. He's a brilliant doctor, and you and your baby are very lucky he was there." Grace was shocked and felt a wave of emotions hit her. Dr. Collins was the same doctor she had refused to let treat her before because of his skin color. He had saved her life and her baby's life. Grace felt deep guilt and shame for how she had judged him. Tears filled her eyes as she thought about how unfair she had been. She quickly turned away from the nurse, trying to hide her tears. Her heart ached as she realized how wrong she had been. As Grace finished packing her things, she thought about how to make things right. She wanted to apologize to Dr. Collins, but didn't know how. She felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude mixed with the pain of her actions. Sitting on the edge of her bed with her packed bag, she remembered how she had dismissed Dr. Collins before. Despite her cruel behavior, he had helped her selflessly when she needed it most. Grace's tears flowed freely as she realized the depth of her mistake and the kindness of the doctor who had saved her. Grace was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. She placed a trembling hand on her belly, feeling the slight swell where her precious baby was growing. She was deeply thankful to Dr. Collins, who had used his skills and quick thinking to save both her and her baby. The realization of his help brought a fresh wave of tears, blending gratitude with deep remorse. Grace's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. The relief that her baby was safe was mixed with the crushing guilt of her past actions. She felt small and insignificant, her previous fears and prejudices now seeming petty and misguided compared to Dr. Collins's compassion and professionalism. As Grace sat grappling with her tumultuous feelings, she knew she had to make things right, but she struggled to figure out how. The task of apologizing for her grievous error in judgment seemed almost impossible. Nevertheless, she understood that she had to try. The next day, Grace took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she waited for Dr. Collins to arrive. She had asked the nurse to call him, knowing she couldn't leave the hospital without facing him. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. When Dr. Collins finally walked into the room, Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. He stood there calm and professional, his kind eyes meeting hers. The sight of him brought back the full force of her shame, and tears began to well up in her eyes. Dr. Collins, she began, her voice trembling. I don't know how to start. He waited patiently as Grace struggled to find the right words. She took another shaky breath, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, she managed to say. Her words choked with emotion. What I did, how I treated you, it was wrong, so terribly wrong. Grace's shoulders shook as she sobbed, overwhelmed by the weight of her actions and the depth of her gratitude. You saved my life and my baby's life, even after I was so cruel to you. I'm ashamed of myself. I don't deserve your kindness. Dr. Collins's expression softened as he listened to Grace's heartfelt apology. He stepped closer to her bed, his voice gentle as he spoke. Mrs. Adams, he said, I appreciate your apology. What's important is that you and your baby are safe. He paused, allowing Grace a moment to collect herself. As a doctor, my duty is to save lives regardless of how I'm treated. I'm just glad I was there when you needed help. His words, filled with genuine compassion, only made Grace cry harder. She felt overwhelmed by his forgiveness and the stark contrast between her behavior and his. Thank you, she whispered, looking up at him through tear-filled eyes. Thank you for everything. As Grace left the hospital, leaning on James for support, she felt a profound shift within her. The warm sunlight on her face seemed to reflect the new light dawning in her heart. She paused for a moment, taking in the bustling world around her with fresh eyes. On the drive home, Grace remained quiet, lost in thought. The events of the past few days replayed in her mind. She couldn't shake the image of Dr. Collins's kind face, his unwavering professionalism, and the depth of his compassion. I've been so wrong, she whispered, more to herself than to James. James glanced at her, concern etched on his face. What do you mean, honey? Grace turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. About everything, James. About people. About what really matters. As they arrived home, Grace slowly made her way to their living room. She sank into the comfortable armchair, her hand resting protectively over her belly. The weight of her prejudice felt heavy on her shoulders, but there was also a sense of lightness, the freedom that comes with opening one's eyes to the truth. I've been so caught up in my fears, she said softly. I thought I was protecting our baby, but all I was doing was teaching myself to judge people based on how they look. James squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. Dr. Collins showed me what true character looks like, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. He saved our baby's life, James. He saved my life, and he did it without hesitation, even after how I treated him. She looked down at her belly, gently caressing it. I want our child to grow up differently. I want them to see people for who they are, not what they look like. I want to teach them love, respect, and openness. Grace's eyes met James's, filled with determination. I'm going to change, James. I have to, for our baby, for myself, for the world we live in. I can't let fear and prejudice guide me anymore. A month later, back at home, Grace began preparing for the baby's arrival with renewed vigor. The nursery, once a source of anxiety, now filled her with hope and excitement. As she folded tiny onesies and arranged stuffed animals, her mind wandered to the profound lessons she had learned. One evening, as Grace and James sat together on the nursery floor, surrounded by baby books and soft blankets, she turned to her husband with tears in her eyes. James, she said softly, I can't stop thinking about how different things could have been. James reached out and took Grace's hand, his eyes full of understanding. We've both learned a lot from this, Grace, and our baby will learn from it too. Grace nodded, her hand resting gently on her belly. I want our baby to grow up seeing the good in people, not just judging them by how they look or what others say about them. We'll teach them that who people are inside is what really matters, James said. As they continued getting the nursery ready for their baby, Grace and James had many deep talks about their own childhoods and what values they wanted to pass on. Grace said, I think about Dr. Collins every day. He was so kind and showed me what real strength is." James smiled and said, "We'll make sure our baby knows Dr. Collins's story. It's a powerful lesson in being kind and forgiving." They made plans to teach their baby about different cultures and perspectives. They talked about books they could read, different playgroups to join, and ways to show their baby that the world is full of wonderful, diverse people. Grace was excited about becoming a mom and wanted to create a loving and accepting home. One sunny afternoon, Grace went to the park and saw children of all backgrounds playing together. She used to feel uneasy or judgmental, but now she saw only the joy and innocence of childhood. A young mother was struggling to push a stroller up a small hill. Grace didn't hesitate. She went over to help. They chatted, and Grace learned that the woman was a recent immigrant. Instead of feeling wary, Grace felt a genuine interest in her story and offered to show her around the neighborhood. At her next prenatal checkup, Grace met a same-sex couple in the waiting room. She listened closely as they shared their journey to parenthood and felt a connection she hadn't allowed herself before. These small interactions made Grace feel warm inside. She realized her world had become richer since she had opened her heart to others. One evening, as she folded laundry, Grace thought about how she had changed. She remembered Dr. Collins's kindness and how it had not only saved her life, but also shown her a better way to live. Tears filled her eyes as she thought about how she had treated him at first. "I was so wrong," she whispered to herself. "But I'm going to do better for my baby, for myself, and for everyone I meet." Grace made a conscious effort to challenge her old thought patterns. Whenever she caught herself making quick judgments, she stopped and thought again. She sought out diverse perspectives in books and documentaries, eager to understand more about the world. As her belly grew, so did her empathy. She started smiling more at strangers, offering help more often, and listening more attentively to other people's stories. She felt lighter inside, as if the weight of her old biases had been lifted. Months passed, and Grace's due date approached. She felt a mix of excitement and nerves. When the big moment came, she and James rushed to the hospital. Their faces showed both joy and anxiety. The labor was tough, but Grace faced it with a strength she didn't know she had. As she pushed and breathed through the pain, she thought of all the women who had given birth before her, from many different backgrounds. This thought gave her courage. After many hours of labor, the room was filled with the tiny cry of their baby. Grace's eyes filled with tears as the nurse placed the small, wriggling bundle on her chest. Looking down at her daughter's perfect little face, Grace was overcome with love and wonder. James, with tears in his eyes, said softly, "She's beautiful." As Grace held her newborn, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She thought of Dr. Collins and how his kindness had made this moment possible. She silently thanked him and promised to pass on the lesson of acceptance to her child. When James asked what they should name their baby, Grace looked at her daughter's bright, promising eyes and felt sure of the answer. "Hope," she said, her voice filled with certainty. The name felt just right. It symbolized everything Grace had learned and the new outlook she had gained. Hope was a symbol of the journey that had brought them to this moment and the future they would build together. As Grace cradled Hope in her arms, she felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that being a mother would have its challenges, but she was ready to face them with an open heart and mind. As the weeks went by and Grace settled into her new role, she felt a strong need to express her gratitude to Dr. Collins. The memory of his kindness and professionalism, despite her initial prejudices, weighed heavily on her heart. One sunny afternoon, while Hope napped peacefully in her crib, Grace decided to take action. She sat at the kitchen table with a blank card in front of her and began to write. Her hand shook slightly as she held the pen, but the words came easily. "Dear Dr. Collins," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. I have been thinking a lot about you and the incredible impact you have had on my life. Grace paused to take a deep breath before continuing. She poured her heart onto the page, thanking Dr. Collins not only for saving her and Hope's lives, but also for the profound change he had sparked within her. Your compassion and dedication opened my eyes to my own prejudices, she wrote. You didn't just save our lives that day, you changed my heart. Because of you, I am committed to raising hope with love and acceptance for all people. As she finished the letter, Grace felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into an envelope addressed to Dr. Collins at the hospital. The next day, with Hope securely fastened in her car seat, Grace drove to the hospital. Her heart raced as she approached the front desk with the letter in hand. "Excuse me," she said to the receptionist, her voice soft but determined. "I was wondering if I could leave this for Dr. Harold Collins." The receptionist smiled warmly. "Of course, I'll make sure he gets it." As Grace handed over the envelope, she felt a sense of peace. She knew no words could fully express the depth of her gratitude, but she hoped Dr. Collins would understand how sincere her message was. Months later, Grace found herself back in the hospital lobby, holding little Hope in her arms. The familiar smell of disinfectant brought back memories of her last visit, but this time she was there for a different reason. "Excuse me," she said softly to the receptionist, her voice trembling a little. "I was wondering if Dr. Harold Collins is available." The receptionist smiled warmly at Grace and the sleeping baby. "Let me check for you. May I ask your name?" "Grace Adams," she replied, shifting Hope gently in her arms. As they waited, Grace looked around the lobby. The last time she had been there, she was full of fear and prejudice. Now, she felt only gratitude and a bit of nervous anticipation. "Mrs. Adams," a nurse said with a kind smile, "Dr. Collins will be able to see you shortly. Would you like to wait in the family room? It's more comfortable there." Grace nodded and followed the nurse to a cozy room with soft chairs and colorful paintings on the walls. As she settled into a chair, Hope stirred and blinked up at her mother with curious eyes. "Oh, sweetie," Grace whispered, stroking her daughter's cheek. "We're here to meet someone very special." Minutes ticked by slowly as Grace rehearsed what she wanted to say, but every time she tried, the words didn't seem right. How could she truly express the deep change Dr. Collins had inspired in her? Suddenly, there was a gentle knock at the door. Grace's breath caught in her throat as Dr. Collins entered. His kind eyes immediately found hers. "Mrs. Adams," he said warmly, glancing at the baby in her arms. "And this must be your little one. How wonderful to see you both." Grace stood, feeling a bit shaky. "Dr. Collins," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I wanted to come and thank you in person for everything." Dr. Collins's warm smile made Grace feel more at ease, even though her heart was still racing with nervous energy. Dr. Collins walked over to Grace with a warm smile and twinkling eyes, looking at the baby, Hope, in her arms. Grace, with a careful and loving touch, handed Hope over to him. Dr. Collins gently cradled the baby, and Grace watched him with a mix of emotions. She felt tears welling up as she thought about what had happened. Grace took a deep breath and said, "Thank you so much, Dr. Collins. You saved both my life and Hope's. You've done so much more than that, though. You've taught me a lesson that I will never forget." Her voice trembled with emotion as she continued, "I am so ashamed of how I treated you before. My prejudice was wrong, and I realize that now." She paused to wipe away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "This experience has opened my eyes to how harmful prejudice can be and how important it is to see people for who they truly are." Dr. Collins listened attentively, his expression gentle and kind. Grace took another deep breath and said, "You showed me what true compassion looks like. Even though I treated you poorly, you put all that aside and saved my life without hesitation. I can't express how sorry I am for my behavior, and I am deeply grateful for your kindness and professionalism." As Dr. Collins gently rocked Hope, who cooed softly in his arms, Grace's heart swelled with emotion. "I promise you, Dr. Collins," Grace said, her voice growing stronger, "I am going to raise Hope to be open-hearted and accepting. I want her to see the world like you do, with compassion and understanding for everyone, no matter their race or background." Dr. Collins's eyes softened as he listened to Grace's heartfelt words. He gently handed Hope back to her mother, who cradled the baby close to her chest. Grace looked at Dr. Collins with tears still brimming in her eyes and continued, "I want Hope to grow up in a world where people are judged by their actions and character, not by the color of their skin." She looked down at her daughter and then back up at Dr. Collins. "You've taught me such a valuable lesson, one that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I am so grateful for that." Dr. Collins nodded, his expression filled with understanding and compassion. Grace's voice grew stronger with each word as she said, "I want Hope to see the world with kindness, empathy, and an open heart. I want her to know that true heroes come in all colors, and that what matters most is how we treat each other." Tears flowed freely down Grace's cheeks. "Your actions showed me what real strength and character look like. You saved us both, even after how terribly I treated you. I can't express how sorry I am for my behavior and how thankful I am for the lesson you've taught me." Dr. Collins reached out and gently placed a hand on Grace's shoulder, offering comfort. Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and determination. "I promise you, Dr. Collins, that I'll do everything in my power to raise Hope with the values you've shown me. I want her to grow up appreciating the beauty and diversity and judging people based on their actions, not their appearance." Dr. Collins's eyes glistened with emotion as he listened to Grace's heartfelt words. He reached out and touched baby Hope's tiny hand. The baby's fingers instinctively curled around his, and a soft smile spread across his face. "Mrs. Adams," he said warmly, "you're already on the right path. The fact that you're here sharing these thoughts with me shows how much you've grown." Grace looked up at him, her eyes still brimming with tears. Dr. Collins continued, his voice filled with wisdom and compassion. "As a mother, you have the power to shape the future. Every day you'll have the opportunity to teach Hope about love, acceptance, and understanding. It's not always easy, but it's so important." He glanced down at Hope, who was now sleeping softly in her mother's arms. "The world needs more people willing to open their hearts and minds, to see beyond skin color and recognize the humanity in everyone. In everyone." Grace nodded, hanging on every word. Dr. Collins's gaze met hers, and she saw the depth of his kindness and forgiveness. "Keep spreading love and understanding, Mrs. Adams, not just to your daughter, but to everyone you meet. It's how we make the world a better place, one interaction at a time." As they stood there, a profound sense of mutual respect and understanding passed between them. It was a moment that transcended race, a connection based on shared humanity and hope for a better future. As Grace stepped out of the hospital doors, she held baby Hope close to her chest. The warm sunlight kissed their faces, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees. Grace took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over her. Looking down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, Grace felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lesson she had learned. It had changed her perspective forever. When she got to the car where James was waiting, she felt a newfound determination. She was no longer the anxious, prejudiced woman who had first entered the hospital months ago. Instead, she was a mother with a mission to raise her daughter with love, acceptance, and understanding. Grace smiled at James as he opened the car door for her. He noticed the change in her demeanor and the peace that radiated from her face. As they settled into the car, Grace to James and said softly, "I want to make sure Hope grows up in a world where love and acceptance are the norm. We have a chance to make a difference, starting with our own family." James nodded and reached out to touch Hope's cheek gently. "We'll do it together," he assured her. As they drove home, Grace felt a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready to face it with an open heart and mind. The lesson she had learned from Dr. Collins would guide her, reminding her always of the power of compassion and the importance of seeing beyond superficial differences.